Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
Blake, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, for those who don't know you, do you mind just giving a quick introduction on yourself? And then I'll talk a little bit about the topic we're going to get into together today.
Great. Yes, my name is Blake Cullimore. I'm a senior analyst at Moody's public rating finance group. I've been rating charter schools for about 15 years now. I've worked on the buy side as well as the rating agency side. And really coming back to charter schools has been a great thing. I really enjoy working with the people in charter schools, with the variety of things in charter schools. It's really just an honor to work with all these different schools out there.
Love it. Well, I'm excited to have you on because we've done a number of episodes talking about school finance. Facilities finance in particular is always a topic of interest amongst leaders, especially depending on the state you're in or city you're in. And one of the things that I felt like it was important for us to maybe unpack a little bit further is understanding bond ratings in general. This is something I know very little about. And so, selfishly, I'm excited to learn from you today. But I thought it would be good to really unpack bond ratings, from your perspective, from the rating side of the house, because I think oftentimes we're sort of only hearing about the investment banker or sort of financial advisor, from that perspective. So maybe we could start with just a quick overview of why bond ratings even matter for charter schools.
Great question, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I think the number one thing really is there's an opportunity here, I think, in the market for cost savings for schools. And I think that's why. They have a number of different avenues they can go down to finance these facilities. And one of those is the capital markets. And they can clearly go out there unrated, but a rated bond generally allows for some cost savings. But it also, I think, builds some credibility in the marketplace, as well as, it provides also a third sort of view of risk assessment for a school, something outside their norm where we're looking at it, primarily from a business perspective, from an investment perspective, from an investor set of eyes. So, I think it helps sort of clarify on those things for a school. But ultimately, I think it's about cost savings and interest rates at the end of the day as schools move to new facilities, add facilities, renovate facilities.
Great. So for someone who knows nothing about bonds, maybe a newer charter school leader or someone who recently stepped into a leadership position, how would you explain bond ratings? Like, what even is a rating? Help us understand a little bit about, some of the different grades. And you mentioned cost savings is a big component here. How does a rating actually impact a school's borrowing costs?
That said, I think the rating, what we call, or a grade, if you want to put it in that context, really is unique because it's meant to assess really the risk of a charter school's ability to make those payments back. And I think what's important is that it's also within the universe of charter schools that we rate. Right. So I think, we have a number of resources I know we're going to talk about on here, but I think those are sort of the big pieces of it. And I think the reality is this, sort of trying to get to the other part of your question here. Those ratings can range around a number of different things and have lots of different factors. So what's critical for us is really to get to know a charter school. For instance, a charter school may have a very basic sort of model about how it thinks it operates, but in the business side of things, that might be different. For instance, their strategy could be they need to grow to accomplish some goals the board has set out. Well, that may have impacts on the rating in terms of debt capacity, abilities like this. But I think what's important that I try to remind schools of is that what we're doing on the rating agency side is important and I think critical for investors, but it shouldn't be sort of imply that that's telling a school how good it is, what it's doing, and those types of things. I think they move in parallel. And to be sure, there is a correlation between those two things, but I don't think it's absolute.
Got it. So you're basically saying, let's not inextricably link, academic performance and your ability to pay back a particular, debt service. Those aren't necessarily correlated, but oftentimes a school that's sort of reached some sort of scale, has strong enrollments, et cetera, is going to be rated higher on that scale you're talking about.
Generally speaking, they correlate, right? But you can imagine, and we see all the time, a school that is a very strong school, good enrollment profile, and let's say they're a K through 8 looking to expand to 9 through 12, right? they're going to take on a large obligation to say, let's build or buy a K through 12 facility. And that's going to have an impact on the school until that ramps up to, full operations and is built into their operating profile, right? If an investor's going to involve, they want to understand what is that impact of that now, because that debt service is typically going to come on sooner than later.
You all at Moody's are really just trying to present the risk profile. And then once you've done that, what happens in terms of, rates for schools on the commercial side, that's really up to the capital markets, investment bankers, et cetera, et cetera. That's how it works. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about the rating landscape, because I think, for most people, they've never thought about getting their school rated until they need to, right? They're not spending a lot of time thinking about, I wonder what our school would be rated. Are we investment grade? Are we not?
Exactly.
Talk to us a little bit about what are the differences between some of the big ratings names, Moody's, S&P, Fitch, et cetera, for charter schools, and how do charter school ratings differ maybe from other kind of organizations, public sector, private sector, or what have you?
I think it's a great question. And the reality is that the different rating agencies have different methodologies, meaning we have a methodology that I think I shared with you and can be shared publicly that says, how do we approach this rating process? That said, we're all trying to get to the same question, and that is, what is the risk of a charter school paying back its investor? So those metrics really don't differ hugely. And let's be honest, if you look at the metrics that a school is evaluating on itself, or an authorizer might, again, there's only so many metrics that we look at. We may look at them slightly differently, but ultimately at the end of the day, they're not wildly different from that perspective. That said, the second part of your question was really, how do we see a charter school different than a public school, especially in an era where we're seeing those funding mechanisms begin to get closer and closer together, which is great to see. But that said, the traditional public school rating goes, number one, it has a completely different methodology that it follows. So we have a set of, as I mentioned, we have a methodology for charter schools. There's one separate for traditional public schools. And under that methodology, there's a fundamental factor is that those are looked at as tax-backed credits, meaning a school district can increase its taxes to pay back that investor, which reduces the overall risk. Charter schools operate under a notion that we think of as a gross revenue pledge, right? That means the revenues that they take in, if they're not restricted, otherwise can be used to pay off the debt service, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, that amount of revenue is limited by their enrollment and their expenses relative to that enrollment. And so they're separate methodologies and really separate what we call pledges or securities underneath them, hence the different methodologies.
So let's get into some of those metrics you alluded to, because to your point, regardless of the agency, there's kind of only so many metrics that can be looked at to really evaluate the risk profile of the school. Take us behind the scenes a little bit from the time that a school wants to get rated. Let's say I'm a CEO of a school and we're thinking about a build or a big renovation or something like that, and we want to get rated. What's that process like? Where does it start? How does Moody's get engaged, or any agency for that matter?
The way this really works is pretty simple. Oftentimes, I'll just be honest with you, there's a financial advisor involved that a school will work with to work out the details, right? So there is some level of items that happen before they get to us. But ultimately, at the end of the day, whether it's a school or whether it's a financial advisor working with a school, they come to Moody's with a request for a rating. And that can come in a few different forms. One is it can come in what we call an indicative request, meaning that it's a private request for a rating between the school and Moody's. It never goes public. It's confidential. And if they've never been rated before, typically we see them come in like that so they can get a sense of where do they stand along that scale that we talked about earlier. And that allows them to make some strategic decisions about how they want to move forward. And let's say they've done the indicative. They say, yes, we're going to go with a rating. All right, now that turns into a public rating. We go back through this rating process once again. And, that's where we look at a whole bunch of documents, and we can get into that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what this happens is typically we'll visit the site, the school, meet with management, meet with board members if they're available and like to. And we really sort of assess the governance structure, assess the authorizer, assess senior management, get to take a look at the facilities and assess those compared to other schools that we rate. Then what happens, we come back and we evaluate that information, look at typically at least 5 years of financials, enrollment profiles over the long term, charter agreements, length, renewals. And eventually this leads to a rating committee where a group of us in Moody's, plus we bring in some other people from other sections of Moody's if it's relevant, and I present a recommendation and we have an up and down vote. So even though may have senior people in there, everybody gets one vote, and then that vote becomes the rating. That same process works for the indicative as well as the public, just so you know. So everyone gets one vote, and then that ultimately becomes the rating that we would communicate to the school.
You mentioned in differentiating charter schools from, traditional public schools where taxes come into play, that enrollment, for example, is really critical, how those schools are actually making their money. From an analytical perspective, you mentioned a bunch of things you guys are looking at: governance structure, 5 years of financials. What would you say? I mean, you may not be able to fully pull back the curtain, but in terms of some of the more important metrics for analyzing charter schools that play into how they ultimately get rated, what are some of those, if you had to, cherry pick a few, maybe 3 to 4 top metrics that really play, an important part in how the rating gets created?
And I'm just going to go back real quick. And just for schools as they're thinking about this, typically the process takes 3 to 4 weeks to go through a rating process.
Okay.
It could take a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, depending on the amount of information available. But just to get a sense of what is that timeline, what's that scale look like? So for the analytical factors, pretty straightforward. We look at scale and demand and enrollment trends. And by scale, what I mean is, does it have gross revenues of 7 million? Does it have gross revenues of 50 million? And really what we're talking about there is operating flexibility. And another portion of that really is demand and enrollment trends. And that's everything, again, sort of from the size. But we also know that New York, for instance, has a much higher per pupil funding than something like Florida, right? So it's balancing out those mechanisms, but it's also looking at applications. It's also looking at academic success. The other couple big ones as we move into the more of the finances is like operating performance, meaning net cash flows, liquidity, how much cash does it have? And those types of, and again, we're talking about operating flexibility, not only in the operations, but also the ability to pay the debt service, capital improvements, and all those investment. And then we look at leverage and debt service coverage. Leverage meaning like how much debt do they have now? How much debt will they have in the future? And, how much of that debt, if you will, is debt service taking up 20% of expenses? Is it taking up 10% of expenses? Again, it comes down to some of those flexibility questions and debt service coverage. Most schools have a covenant, let's say, of 1.1 times. We look at that as a minimal, not the target. And so how strong is that school relative to be able to cover that debt service? And then the last one, which is a really big one, which is one of the qualitative ones, and that is charter renewal risk and government relations. From a governance perspective, how strong is their governance model? How strong is the authorizer? We've dealt with some authorizers that have hundreds of schools. We've dealt with other authorizers that have 2 schools.
Right.
And the question is like, how strong are even the state statutes? Meaning, is there politics involved with the authorizer, and will this become a risk? Because what we're really talking about here is typically a 30 to 40 year obligation for the school. Pretty much no charter agreement goes that long, right? And things are going to change in that time period. So we're truly trying to get a sense of what that world looks like.
You mentioned this bucket of qualitative factors as well as all of the quantitative things that you alluded to. Obviously, it's pretty cut and dry, days cash on hand or something like that. How do you all balance measuring the more qualitative things, like whether it's sort of governance structure, or like you said, maybe it has to do with authorizer, maybe it's even instructional model and things like that? How do you all think about balancing that, given some of those more qualitative factors could be subjective from, analyst to analyst?
So you asked a couple of questions inside of that. So let me just sort of like try to take that apart. And if I miss a piece, let me know.
Okay.
So I think number one, if we go back to this methodology, our methodology really sort of plays it out in something that has a scorecard. So I would encourage anyone to take a quick look at that, because it's like a one piece of paper that anyone could look at to see how we sort of generally think about things at a 50,000 foot level. And in that scorecard, basically what we've said is quantitative factors, meaning your financial statement analysis, so on and so forth, makes up about 60% of a score that we might put on. So when we talk about that rating at the end of the day, about 60% of it is reserved by that, meaning that the qualitative really is about 40%. And to be sure, then there's a lot of areas in there that we have to make the best call we can as analysts and how those weighting factors play into it. But that's sort of the general breakdown there is along those lines. I know you had more in that question, Dan, and I forget what the other pieces were.
The scorecard is helpful. And I think what I was trying to understand is how do you all come up with sort of an evaluation of some of the more, I don't know if subjective is the right word, but for those qualitative factors around, governance, instructional model, authorizer relationship, how do you all sort of rank those on the scorecard, given it's just frankly really hard sometimes to read the scenarios or even something like instructional model,
No, and I think, we'll see in the scorecard that we do define it to a certain extent, but to give us short of it, let's think of it this way. A brand new charter school with a 3 to 5 year charter, right? No renewal. And then you put that in the context of it's ramping up its enrollment compared to a school that, let's say, has a 15-year charter and it's their second or third charter or something along those lines. I mean, let's say they started out with a 5-year charter. They grew to a 10-year charter. Now they're at a 15-year charter and they're a high-performing school, meaning that, they're getting good grades. I'm using some terminology probably relative to Florida a little bit because as an analyst, that tends to be one of my focus areas. We have people that focus in Colorado, California, but, looking at strong academics, again, and a track record. So I think when we think about qualitative factors, it's really about the track record. It's about demonstrated success. And then, so when I'm thinking about, one of the other areas that's very difficult to assess, but you look at boards, right? And then we see boards that are 5 people and less. We see boards that are 10 people. And who are on those boards? Is it all parents? Is it a developer that's driving this? Is it a broad base of people that will support that ultimate mission and the credit quality of the schools that niche through where we are looking at it? So all those factors come into play. And are there a good set of board policies? Conflicts of interest, cash levels that the school wants to keep, enrollment targets. How are they evaluating that? And we look at the strategic plan as well and understand it within that context.
I believe you mentioned earlier, these ratings are sort of within the context of the charter world. Is that correct? Could you maybe explain that a little bit? If I'm a charter school in Tampa, since we're talking about Florida, am I being benchmarked against other schools within Hillsborough County, or is it sort of nationally still, but maybe referenced locally to the state? How does that work?
To answer your question, it's a little bit of all of that.
Okay.
So think about it this way. So number one, what we have to do and what we do is, let's just take finances. We have to make some adjustments to finances, but we print and publish medians for the whole sector. And so we cover around 150 schools across the country, right? And so we have medians for every rating category that we rate in along that. And so what we'll do is we'll take one school, compare it to those national medians, if you will, along those quantitative and qualitative scores. But individually, let's recognize that, a school that operates in a certain demographic area may have different types of academics. And so what we're going to do then is we're going to look at that school compared to its peer group in its service area, right? And that could include public schools, include the school district, and other charter schools in that area. And so we'll also look at those regional pieces of that and how that fits into the picture.
Makes sense. And those medians are published publicly? Okay.
They're published and they're available, I think, through moodys.com. And we can talk about how to get to some of that information if anybody's interested.
Okay, cool.
Someone can always reach out to me and we can figure that out.
Great. We'll try and link to some of that in the show notes. Let's talk a little bit about some practical guidance, because I know we've hit on some of the financial things you guys are looking at, some of the operational things you're looking at. Practically for schools that maybe are not ready to be rated, or maybe they're thinking about in their 5-year plan in year 3, they're talking about getting out of this lease they're in and trying to go build a building or whatever it is.
Yep.
There's a host of scenarios. What can schools be doing now today, whether it's from the board perspective or whether you're the CFO, to prepare the organization to kind of put the best possible foot forward as it relates to ratings?
Before I answer that question, there's a big caveat that has to occur, is that rating agencies or Moody's Ratings is not allowed to give advice.
Okay.
Right. So I can't go tell you, hey, School of Blake, this is what you need to do to get an X rating, right? We don't do that. We're not allowed to do that. But let's talk about just sort of some general
principles. Yeah.
Principles around that. And I think as a school's brand, to be honest with you, I don't think it's doing a whole lot probably than what a good school would do now. And that would be tracking its enrollment trends, meeting its targets set itself for, and understanding when it misses those targets, why it's missed those targets, and how they're modifying that. And showing, a strong or the relationship, good or bad, however those matter, between the different pieces of the school, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, again, I keep referring to the methodology, but if we go to the methodology, that is sort of, a picture of where are we going to focus our questions? What are we going to ask about? And I got to be honest with you, having talked to schools, for over 15 years, I would say that this process is often something that they've sort of said, wow, it's great to be able to get together, and we've all had to think about something that we think about individually and put it in a complete package. And what I'm doing as an analyst is trying to understand what that package of the school is. Where are they now in their life cycle? Are they just a beginner, a toddler, pre-kindergarten? Are they kindergarten? Are they in those elementary pieces, or are they very mature in their thing? And what they want to do go forward, how does that fit into that? And the credit rating really speaks to all those items. We have schools that are in a really strong growth mode, and that might be good for them, but it brings risks with it.
What are some of those, I don't know if risks is the right word, or maybe common mishaps? I know you're not able to give advice, but from a generic principles standpoint, are there things that are kind of low-hanging fruit that schools can avoid that would impact their rating? I don't know, whether it's not having enough cash on hand, or to your point, maybe it's just not really faithfully tracking enrollment trends. Are there other things that come to mind that are sort of no-brainers that schools should avoid as far as potential mistakes or kind of mishaps?
Yeah, I think that's one because of what we had said before about advice, that's a very difficult question to answer. And so what I would say is this, is that a school needs to be able to understand, I think from my perspective, why certain things happened in this environment and why it responded in certain ways to environment. For instance, what's a red flag? So for any charter school across the country, when we begin to see application or enrollment numbers decline,
Right.
Hey, things happen in 1 year, right? So we've seen that. We can go back to COVID and see all sorts of things. Some bumped up, some bumped down in terms of enrollment. But it's understanding that and how a school responded to those challenges. A changing demographic profile. A school that used to be on the way to where people drove in the morning, now half of those people stay at home and work at home.
Right.
How does that change that? And the same thing with weakening academics. Why is that happening? And understanding those questions. Because if you think about it, we talked about that revenue pledge that comes from the per pupil funding, right? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, that's going to drive a lot of the other decisions.
Super helpful. All right. So Blake, as we come to a close here, you mentioned Moody's has a number of resources. There's other, publicly available resources. We always like to ask guests for things that we can either link in the show notes or point folks to. What can we send our audience to by way of resources as a follow-up from this conversation?
I think the methodologies is just a great resource.
Okay.
To be sure. And I think that provides a lot of explanations in there about how do we approach things and why do we approach it the way we do it. I think another place for a resource there is, and I just have to find out what the cost on it is, if there's any cost about, and what we can share is about a medians piece and our outlook pieces, which are general research pieces we do annually. And the reason those are good is like you could sort of pick sort of a school of a certain rating and understand, because most of these calculations are explained in the methodology and they're not difficult calculations, just so a school can at least get a ballpark of how it relates to what we're doing. I think those are good resources. And the other places, I think, talking to schools that have gotten ratings. The one of the things I really enjoy about the charter school sector is that it's a small family. And, the strongest out there, I think, as much as they all compete with each other, are more than willing to help out everybody else and vice versa.
Totally.
I think talking to those schools and finding out, what worked for those schools and what didn't work for those schools would be a great place to start for any school along those lines.
Love it. Okay, perfect. We'll see what we can link to in the show notes. And then if people want to connect with you or want to reach out to you, should we send them to LinkedIn or elsewhere? Should we send people who are curious maybe to chat with you further, Blake?
We will share my contact information at Moody's, and you'll have my email and phone number there. And, I would encourage anyone with any questions to reach out and give me a call. And again, my caveat is I'm not going to be able to tell you how much it costs. I'm going to pass that one along. But, I really enjoy talking about charter schools. And to be honest, I learn as much from talking to these people as much as I do when I'm doing this. So I really enjoy that opportunity to talk with any charter school about these types of things, or board members and senior staff members. So
fantastic. Well, Blake, thanks so much again for coming on the show and unpacking ratings a little bit for us. I know I learned a lot, and hopefully those listening did as well.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's been a really great time to talk with you, and I love these conversations.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@buyq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.